The fields south of Caen smelled of cordite and cattle. Norman hedgerows, thick with summer growth, lined the sunken lanes where Sherman tanks sat hull down behind earth banks, their crews brewing tea on small stoves and waiting for the next attack order that would send them forward into the same killing ground they had crossed yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that. Somewhere ahead, through the haze of summer heat and drifting smoke, the spires of Caen's medieval churches rose above a skyline that Allied bombers had already half destroyed. It was July of 1944. 6 weeks had passed since D-Day. The greatest amphibious invasion in history had put 150,000 men ashore on the beaches of Normandy on a single day. The world expected those men to be racing toward Paris by now. Instead, on the British and Canadian sector east of the beachhead, the front line had barely moved. The maps at headquarters showed gains measured in fields, not in miles. And the man responsible for this apparent paralysis was sitting in his tactical headquarters in a caravan parked beneath apple trees in an orchard near Crowley, wearing his trademark beret and 2 cap badges, studying his maps with the calm certainty of a general who believed everything was going exactly according to plan. His name was Bernard Montgomery, meticulous, egotistical, the master of the set-piece battle who refused to attack until every detail was prepared. He was the most famous British general of the war, and by the summer of 1944, one of the most controversial. The press adored him, his soldiers trusted him, his allies were beginning to despise him, and the question that hung over the entire Normandy campaign, a question that military historians have argued about for 80 years and have never definitively resolved, was whether Montgomery was executing a brilliant operational design or simply failing and claiming the failure was deliberate. The plan for D-Day had been clear. The British and Canadian forces landing on Gold, Juno and Sword beaches were to push inland rapidly and capture Caen, the largest city in the invasion area, on the first day. Caen sat at the hinge of the Normandy beachhead. It controlled the road network leading south and east toward Paris. It anchored the flat, open ground south of the city that Allied planners wanted for airfield construction. Taking Caen on June 6 was not an aspirational goal. It was a planning assumption on which subsequent operations depended. Caen did not fall on June 6. It did not fall in June at all. The assault troops of the 3rd British Infantry Division, who had fought their way off Sword Beach under heavy fire, pushed inland through the afternoon, but were stopped 3 miles short of Caen by the 21st Panzer Division's counterattack. The Germans drove a wedge between Sword and Juno beaches and nearly reached the coast before being halted. It was the closest the Germans came to splitting the beachhead on D-Day, and it ended any hope of taking Caen in the first 24 hours. In the days that followed, German reinforcements arrived with a speed that surprised Allied intelligence. The 12th SS Panzer Division, composed of fanatical Hitler Youth soldiers under Brigadeführer Kurt Meyer, reached the Caen sector on June 7 and fought with a ferocity that shocked even experienced British formations. Panzer Lehr, one of the best equipped armoured divisions in the Wehrmacht, arrived shortly after. Elements of the 2nd Panzer Division followed. By mid-June, the densest concentration of German armour in Normandy was facing the British and Canadian forces east of the beachhead, not the Americans fighting through the hedgerow country in the west. The front line around Caen had solidified into something that looked, to the untrained eye and to many trained ones, like the Western Front of the previous war. Montgomery launched a series of operations to break the deadlock. Operation Epsom in late June, Operation Charnwood in early July, Operation Goodwood on July 18, which threw 3 armoured divisions into a narrow corridor east of Caen in what appeared to be a major breakthrough attempt. Each operation gained ground measured in hundreds of metres. Each cost thousands of casualties. Goodwood alone cost the British over 5,000 men and 400 tanks in 3 days, according to the figures compiled by Carlo d'Este in Decision in Normandy. published in 1983. After Goodwood, Caen was finally in British hands, or what remained of it. The city had been devastated by Allied bombing. But the breakthrough that everyone expected had not materialised. The British and Canadian forces were still grinding forward at a pace that seemed to belong to 1916, not 1944. The reaction at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force was fury. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder, Eisenhower's deputy and the second most powerful officer in the Allied command structure, openly lobbied for Montgomery's removal. As Tedder's biographer Vincent Orange documented in Tedder Quietly in Command, published in 2004, Tedder told colleagues that Montgomery had failed and should be replaced. He was not alone. Conyngham, commanding the 2nd Tactical Air Force, shared Tedder's contempt. Senior staff officers at SHAEF headquarters in Bushy Park whispered about Montgomery's removal as though it were a matter of when, not whether. Eisenhower's frustration is recorded in his own correspondence, preserved at the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas. In a letter to Montgomery on July 7, Eisenhower urged him to launch a major offensive without further delay, writing that time was vital and that the Allies could not afford to remain penned in the beachhead indefinitely. A week later, Eisenhower wrote to his Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, expressing his mounting concern that the British sector had stalled. The implication running through every communication was unmistakable. Eisenhower believed Montgomery was too cautious, too slow, and too unwilling to accept the casualties that a breakthrough demanded. American commanders were blunter. Omar Bradley, commanding the 1st United States Army on the western half of the beachhead, was struggling with his own problems in the hedgerow country around St. Lo. But at least Bradley was visibly trying to advance. Montgomery, in the American view, appeared to be sitting on his hands while issuing communiques about progress that no one on the ground could see. The British press, initially supportive, began to ask questions. Churchill, sensitive to any suggestion that British soldiers were not pulling their weight alongside the Americans, grew anxious. The political pressure on Montgomery was enormous. Montgomery's response to all of this was a serene indifference that infuriated his critics and reassured his staff in roughly equal measure. He insisted that the battle was proceeding as planned. He stated in conversations, in correspondence, and in briefings to Eisenhower that his intention from the beginning had been to draw the German armour onto the British sector and hold it there, creating the conditions for an American breakout on the western flank. The British and Canadians were the anvil. The Americans would be the hammer. Caen was not the objective. Caen was the magnet. Whether this was true is the question that has defined Montgomery's reputation ever since. If you are finding value in these stories of British command decisions, subscribing helps this channel continue telling them. Montgomery claimed a master plan. His critics called it an alibi. The evidence supports both readings, and that is what makes this story impossible to resolve cleanly. The case for Montgomery's version rests on documents and statements he made before the battle. At the St. Paul's School briefing on April 7, 1944, 2 months before D-Day, Montgomery presented his operational concept to senior Allied commanders including Eisenhower, Churchill, and King George VI. The briefing notes, preserved in Montgomery's papers at the Imperial War Museum, describe a plan in which the British forces would attract and pin the main enemy reserves, particularly the panzer divisions, while the American forces swung south and east. Montgomery's Chief of Staff, Major General Francis de Guingamp, confirmed this interpretation in his memoir Operation Victory, published in 1947. Writing that the plan always envisaged the British holding firm while the Americans broke out. Montgomery himself, in his memoir published in 1958, was explicit. He wrote that his strategy in Normandy had been consistent from the outset. The British and Canadian forces would fight a holding battle on the eastern flank, engaging and destroying German armour, while the Americans prepared and executed their breakout. Every operation he launched around Caen, including Epsom, Charnwood, and Goodwood, was designed not to achieve a breakthrough, but to keep the German panzer divisions committed to the British sector and prevent them from being transferred west to face the Americans. The grinding, attritional nature of the fighting was not failure, it was function. The numbers support this interpretation in one critical respect. By late July, the distribution of German forces in Normandy was dramatically lopsided. According to the intelligence summaries compiled by the 21st Army Group and cited by Max Hastings in Overlord, published in 1984, 7 of the 8 German panzer divisions in Normandy were deployed against the British and Canadian sector. The 9th, 10th and 12th SS Panzer Divisions, the 2nd and 116th Panzer Divisions, Panzer Lehr, and the 21st Panzer Division were all committed to holding the line east of the Orne. The American front was held primarily by infantry divisions, many of them weakened by weeks of hedgerow fighting and understrength in both men and armour. When Bradley launched Operation Cobra on July 25, preceded by a massive carpet bombing that obliterated the Panzer Lehr division in its positions, the armoured reserve that might have sealed the breach was 80 miles to the east, locked in combat with Montgomery's forces. Cobra succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. The German line disintegrated. Within 48 hours, American armour was in open country. Within a week, Patton's Third Army was activated and pouring through the gap, with columns racing into Brittany south toward the Loire and east toward the Seine. The German Seventh Army, caught in the pocket around Falaise, was subjected to devastating air and ground attack. By the end of August, the German position in Normandy had been destroyed. Paris was liberated on August 25th. That collapse happened, at least in part, because the panzer divisions were not where they needed to be to stop it, and they were not there because they were fighting the British. The case against Montgomery is equally compelling. It rests on a simple observation. If the attritional battle around Caen was always the plan, why did Montgomery repeatedly launch operations that looked, sounded, and were briefed as breakthrough attempts? Operation Goodwood is the central exhibit. Before the attack on July 18, Montgomery told Eisenhower's headquarters that he intended to break through the German lines east of Caen and exploit southward with 3 armoured divisions, the 7th, 11th, and Guards armoured divisions, the largest concentration of British armour deployed in a single operation since El Alamein. The language in his signals, analysed in detail by Carlo d'Este in Decision in Normandy, was the language of exploitation, not attrition. He wrote of engaging the German armour in battle, and of writing it down to such an extent that it is of no further value as a basis of the battle. Eisenhower believed a major breakthrough was imminent. Tedder and the air commanders allocated over 2,000 heavy bombers to support the attack, the largest tactical air bombardment of the war to that point. When Goodwood stalled after gaining 7 miles at a cost of over 5,000 casualties and 400 tanks, Eisenhower was not merely disappointed. He felt deceived. The gap between what Montgomery had promised and what he delivered was too wide to explain as operational friction. Either Montgomery had genuinely intended a breakthrough and failed, or he had deliberately oversold the operation to secure the air support he needed for what was really an attritional holding action. Neither interpretation reflected well on him. d'Este's conclusion, shared by many historians, is that Montgomery's master plan narrative was at least partially a post hoc construction. The original plan did call for Caen to fall on D-Day. It did not. Montgomery then adapted, turning necessity into strategy and reframing the costly attritional battle as deliberate design. This does not mean the strategy was wrong. It means it may not have been the strategy Montgomery chose. It may have been the strategy that chose him. The historian Anthony Beevor in D-Day, The Battle for Normandy, published in 2009, argued that the truth lies somewhere between the two positions. Montgomery did understand, from early in the campaign, that drawing German armour onto the British front would benefit the Americans. That much is consistent with his pre-invasion briefings and with the basic logic of the operational situation. The Germans were always going to commit their armour to the sector closest to Paris, which was the British sector. Geography and strategic logic dictated it, but Montgomery also wanted to take Caen quickly, and when he could not, he adjusted his narrative to present the delay as intentional. He turned the constraints imposed by the battlefield into the virtues of a deliberate plan. The distinction matters enormously for Montgomery's reputation as a strategist. It does not change what happened on the ground. What happened on the ground was this. British and Canadian soldiers fought one of the most intense attritional battles of the Western European campaign. The fighting around Caen consumed divisions. The 50th Northumbrian Division, which had stormed Goal Beach on D-Day, was so weakened by casualties over the following weeks that it had to be broken up for replacements later in the campaign. The 43rd Wessex Division suffered heavily during Operation Jupiter on Hill 112, a position that changed hands repeatedly in some of the bitterest fighting of the entire Normandy battle. The Guards Armoured Division, the 7th Armoured Division, and the 11th Armoured Division were all committed to repeated attacks that gained small amounts of terrain at disproportionate cost. Tank crews in the Normandy bocage and the open wheat fields south of Caen faced German Tiger and Panther tanks that outranged and outgunned their Shermans at every engagement distance. A Sherman could be destroyed by a Tiger at 2,000 yards. A Sherman had to close to 500 yards to penetrate a Tiger's frontal armour. The mathematics of those engagements were merciless. Infantry fought through villages that changed hands multiple times in a single day. The casualty figures for the British and Canadian sector between June 6 and the end of July, cited by John Ellis in Brute Force, published in 1990, exceeded 60,000 men killed, wounded, and missing. British infantry replacement pools were running dry by August, a manpower crisis that would constrain operations for the rest of the war. Those soldiers paid the price, whether the plan was deliberate or improvised. And the outcome, the distribution of German armour that made Cobra possible, was real regardless of whether Montgomery designed it from the beginning or recognised it as it developed. The comparison that illuminates the debate most clearly is with Slim's operations in Burma during the same period. Slim, who would never claim credit for a success he had not planned, described his own decision-making with a transparency that Montgomery was incapable of. Where Slim acknowledged mistakes and credited others, Montgomery claimed infallibility and credited himself. The irony is that Montgomery's strategy at Caen, whether planned or emergent, worked. The American breakout succeeded. The German army in Normandy was destroyed. France was liberated. Montgomery won. But he won in a way that made it impossible for anyone to agree on what exactly he had won, or whether he had meant to win it that way. Eisenhower never fully forgave Montgomery for the weeks of frustration around Caen. Tedder continued to regard Montgomery with suspicion and barely concealed hostility for the rest of the war. American commanders, from Bradley downward, formed opinions about British caution and Montgomery's ego that shaped Allied relations for the remainder of the European campaign and beyond. The political damage Montgomery inflicted on the Anglo-American alliance during those 8 weeks in Normandy would resurface at every subsequent disagreement about strategy, most notably during the Market Garden debacle in September of 1944, when Montgomery's insistence on a single narrow thrust into the Netherlands ended in the disaster at Arnhem. The trust that had been eroded at Caen was never fully restored. Montgomery himself never wavered. Not once. He maintained until his death in 1976 that the Normandy campaign had been fought exactly as he had intended from the first day. He wrote it in his memoirs. He said it in interviews. He repeated it to journalists, to historians, and to anyone who asked, with a conviction so absolute that it became impossible to tell whether he was defending a genuine strategic vision or whether he had told the story so many times that the telling had replaced the truth. The fields south of Caen are quiet now. The hedgerows are still there, thicker than they were in 1944, growing over the scars in the earth where tanks burned and men died. The question of what Montgomery intended has never been settled and probably never will be. But the outcome is not in dispute. 7 panzer divisions faced the British. 1 faced the Americans. Cobra broke through. France was liberated. Whether Montgomery was the architect of that result or its most fortunate beneficiary depends on which documents you read, which historians you trust, and how much credit you are willing to give.